The idea that science is the only tool we can use to answer the big questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And what happens when we die? And of course, those are the questions that are answered between the covers of the Bible. But if we cede to science the ideas that, okay, the earth is 6 billion years old, or the solar system is 15 billion years old, or whatever, and we've got to somehow shoehorn then 6,000 or 10,000 years of biblical time into that 15, the standard reaction is, well, you just got to have faith. And so we have to reject science.
Yep.
What Void Earth does is say, no, there is no contradiction here. We don't deny the data, the scientific data. We just argue over the interpretation of the data, and perhaps the tools that the scientists are using are not correct, because there are flaws in their tools that they acknowledge and admit, but they won't then address them. And so they're stuck on their belief that the universe is 15 billion years old, except there's a new study that just came out, and I mentioned that in the documentary, that, wait, no, it's not 15 billion, it's 26 billion. So wait a minute, I thought the science was settled on this issue. Now you're saying it's 26 billion years old? What is it? Is the science really settled after all? No, it isn't, and that's one of the main points that we bring up in the documentary.
Now, that's a perfect introduction for Genesis 1:1, which I just have to read. In the beginning, God created the heaven, it says in my good old King James translation, the heaven and the earth. And there have been a number of books written about Genesis 1:1, 2, 3, and so forth. But maybe we could just substitute the word universe. God created the universe, which included the earth. And where do we go from there? And in your research, in your writing, where do we take that?
Well, we have to go to verse 2, which is the earth was without form and void, but there is a question as to whether the original Hebrew, which is more nuanced than our English translations. I think that's the other thing. We as English speakers need to realize the Bible wasn't written in English. Yeah. So the original language may have some different shadings or nuance.
That's why I pushed on the word of heaven.
Right.
A lot of people say the heavens and the earth.
Well, and actually the Hebrew is shemayim, which is plural.
Plural.
So it is heavens.
Okay.
So what are the multiple heavens? Paul mentioned a second heaven and a third heaven. So what are we talking about?
Glad you said that.
Yeah, because there is a spirit realm that is outside the perception of most of us humans, and he created the angelic realm to occupy that domain, created Adam and Eve and their children to occupy this domain, which is why when Jude talks about the sinful angels of Genesis 6, they kept not their proper estate. They left their proper dwelling. They kept not their first estate in the King James, meaning that they didn't stay where they were created to be. They came here and interfered in the natural order of things because they weren't supposed to be here. So there are multiple heavens. But did God go directly from that to creating, light? And then, the 7 days of creation. And Void Earth suggests that, no, there was something that was created that was intended to be perfect, and it became formless and void. And that is what's explored here. And that also has some explanatory power for reconciling the apparent differences between the number of years described in the Bible and the number of years science said it required for us to get from creation to where we are.
And there's a very important word in became that we need to remember. This is based on the Hebrew haya. And what that really means is became, but unfortunately it is translated into English in Genesis 1:1 and 2 as was. The earth was. Well, now what that sounds like, if you put that in incredibly simple terms, it sounds like God is in the middle of creating a planet and making all things that we now can see and observe. And it, at that time, hadn't been completely developed yet. Mm-hmm. He was still working on it. Like it sounds midway done when we say it was without form and void. But that's the word haya in Hebrew. It's the same word that we get over in Genesis 19 and 26 that says that Lot's wife became haya, a pillar of salt. Now, why, and over in the Psalms, we have it in several places. Why does that word over here get translated in English as was? Well, that's a whole conversation that could go into multiple different directions, but the bottom line, the word means that the Lord was creating the heavens and the earth, that he had done a creation, and then something happened to it that became without form and void. Now, the words without form and void, really honestly, if I had 3 hours to get into all of the different scholars that weighed in on this, the book did so. We did get into it, some of it in Void Earth, the documentary. But the bottom line is that the overwhelming majority of Hebrew experts, scholars, who are not only very well learned in the language of Hebrew, but also in the obsolete Hebrew dialects, including biblical euphemisms and patterns of speech that are completely obsolete today and no longer even in use. They are experts in this field of what it is the writer was trying to convey. And a better translation is that in the beginning there was the earth, and then it was rendered an uninhabitable wasteland of chaos. It just doesn't say who did so. And that's where we kind of come in and see where all voices merge. That's where all voices merge.
What we're supposed to understand then is something horrible happened. We're supposed to take note of the fact that something horrible happened, and then God reacted in the way that is illustrated as you go through Genesis. The creation of Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, and all the creation, right up to the time of the great flood of Noah. We see that something happened and there were consequences for that something. And I think that's where the disagreement comes in teaching.
And this, what Donna's describing is not just trying to come up with a new and novel way of understanding Genesis 1 verse 1 to come up with a new book and a new DVD. There is biblical evidence of this, as we mentioned on the broadcast program, Isaiah 45:18, where the prophet writes that God created the heavens, he is God, who formed the earth and made it, he established it. He did not create it empty, he formed it to be inhabited. That implies that the earth was created to be inhabited, that again, something terrible happened that left it formless and void, chaotic and empty, and that God had to then step in. And Genesis 1 verse 2 suggests that this was the subduing of chaos. The earth was without form and void, darkness was over the face of the deep, and the word there, deep, is Tehom, which is a cognate for a Sumerian word, Tiamat. Well, Tiamat just happens to be the name of the Sumerian chaos dragon or chaos monster that had to be subdued by a warrior god.
You mentioned dragon, and that the plot thickens.
Yes. Dragons, in fact, Sharon and I wrote about this in our book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons. Dragons are, we've got this Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien idea of, Smaug and the dragons being these flying reptiles. But even in Scripture, there is a hint that some of the angelic realm may be serpentine in appearance. The Nakash in Genesis chapter 3, the serpent in the garden. Clearly not a talking snake. Eve didn't freak out when the serpent spoke to her because it was something she was used to seeing.
Right.
But the word Nakash is used in Numbers 21, for example, interchangeably with the word seraph, which is the singular form of seraphim, the Nakashim seraphim, the fiery serpents that bit the Israelites, and Moses had to put the serpent on the bronze pole. So it suggests that the seraphim, who we only see elsewhere in Isaiah 6, his throne room vision of God, may have had a serpentine appearance. So you've got these radiant serpentine things, flying fiery, what would you call a flying fiery serpent except a dragon?
Right.
But clearly in Revelation 12, Satan described as a dragon, and Leviathan described by the prophet Isaiah and in the Psalms as a dragon. Isaiah 27 verse 1, in fact, which is a prophecy of the ultimate destruction of Leviathan, which is the embodiment of chaos, which is what we're talking about in Genesis 1 verse 2, formlessness and void and emptiness, chaos. Leviathan, that dragon that lives in the sea, God will ultimately destroy it. So that's what we're dealing with. And this is a story that is repeated again and again in ancient Mesopotamian religion, where Tiamat of Sumer had to be defeated by Marduk. That's part of the Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish. In Canaanite religion, it's Baal who defeats Yam, which is, by the way, the Hebrew word for sea, which is significant. The chaos
is.
dragon, in fact, the Isaiah 27:1 actually borrows from the Baal cycle in describing Leviathan as that fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent. That's a quote from the Baal cycle from 500 years before the time of Isaiah. So this is a well-known story in the ancient world. A warrior god, Zeus, Typhon, Set, Apophis, God, Yahweh, and Leviathan. That's the original story. These others are fake news versions of that story.
Yeah.
Chaos had to be subdued for the world to be created and inhabitable for humanity. And the pagans had the story. It was just a twisted version of what's in Scripture.